In John chapter 9, there's a rather well known story where Jesus heals a blind man at a place known as the Pool of Siloam. So we read it and we think of it as just some area in Jerusalem where people could go and get water, and it was that. But because we're separated from the biblical world by a long time and a great distance and a different culture completely, we don't know the story behind the Pool of Siloam. And what's interesting is to go back and find out where it came from. Well, if you go back, you actually have to go all the way back to 2 Chronicles 32, and we won't read it. Let me just tell you what happens there. There's a king named Hezekiah in Jerusalem, and he is aware that trouble is coming to Jerusalem. The nation known as Assyria, the Assyrian Empire, which you've probably heard of from world history and certainly from biblical history, that nation, that empire was expanding. They were invading the territories of their neighbors and other countries in an effort to build their own power base. And one of the things that Hezekiah was convinced was going to happen is that the Assyrians would come and they would lay siege to Jerusalem. Now, let me explain the idea behind a siege. Probably most of you know, but just in case. The way warfare was conducted in those days, oftentimes an invading army would come in, and rather than engaging in a pitched battle with the army of the nation they were invading, they would simply come to the capital city, and these cities were built with walls around the perimeters, and they would surround the city with their forces. And the greater, stronger army would generally be outside, and then inside the city, behind these walls, which represented safety, the defenders would be there. And in many cases, there wouldn't be a traditional military battle. Instead, the stronger army outside would simply force the army on the inside, the city residents on the inside, force them to surrender through starvation. Because after a while, the people inside the city would run out of food. They needed food from the outside, brought in by farms and farmers in the area. And when there was a siege around the nation or around the city, it couldn't happen. And another thing that would happen, even more dire than the lack of food, would be the lack of water. You can go without food for quite a while. You don't want to, but you can. But you can't go without water very long. And so by cutting off the water supplies into a city, these armies laying siege would shorten the length of the siege significantly. And so back in the days of Hezekiah, he knew the Assyrians were coming. And inside Jerusalem, there was this Pool of Siloam, which was fed from an underground channel going way back to the days before Jerusalem was even an Israelite city. And outside, there was a spring. Outside Jerusalem, there was a spring known as the Spring of Gihon. And that spring was a freshwater source, and the water from that spring came underground into Jerusalem. But Hezekiah knew that if the Assyrians could cut off the spring, they would cut off the water flow into Jerusalem. And so what he did, he went out and he covered up the top of the spring. So the water was still there, and it was still flowing, but the access to the water could not be gotten at from the outside. And so even if an army came around and surrounded Jerusalem, they couldn't cut off the water. And inside Jerusalem, the Pool of Siloam would continue to provide drinking water for the people trapped inside, even in the worst of circumstances. Psalm 46 is a psalm that a lot of Old Testament scholars feel might have a reference to this Pool of Siloam. It talks about, in the beginning of the psalm, times of trouble. Listen to verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Beginning of verse 2, therefore we will not fear. Why? Well, in part because they knew that no matter who came against them, who laid siege to them, they wouldn't run out of the most essential element for life after air, which is water. Look at verse 4. There is a river whose streams shall make glad the city of God. That was one of the names the Jewish people had for Jerusalem, the city of God. There is a river whose streams shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High. There are a couple ways you can view that. Of course, first of all, in their day, they would have seen that as that little underground river that made sure the people in Jerusalem had water to drink, even in the worst of times. But in our day, the idea that we can seize on, and really this would have also been evident even in the days this psalm was being written, is that the river of God is also spiritual. In times of trouble, surrounded by our enemies, surrounded by difficulty, and not knowing which way to turn, there is a river represented by the presence of God's Holy Spirit and the streams of God's Spirit, the flow of God's Spirit can make our hearts glad. Even when there's no physical answer, when there's no earthly answer, we can rest in the Lord. And that's why in this same psalm, Psalm 46, verse 10, contains a very striking image. And many of you have heard this verse. Some of you have heard it so often you've memorized it. Be still and know that I am God. The Hebrew word that's actually translated be still is a interesting word. It does mean to be still, but literally, if you translate that word as it literally would have been used back in the day that this psalm was written, it meant two things. Number one, it meant to relax. Number two, it meant to sink. Interesting word. Sink. When you're surrounded by trouble, when you don't have an answer, when you don't know which way to turn, because of the river of the presence of God, you can sink into God's presence. That's not a passive, oh, I hope it works out, I'm just going to sit here and wait to die thing. That's not at all it. It's actually putting your faith in God, not in yourself. See, the two great mistakes people make when we're in trouble. Number one, we want to run around, stay busy, do all kinds of things that we think will solve the problem. And we do it in our own strength and it doesn't work. Number two, we want to give up hope. And in the name of trusting God, we do nothing. We just give up hope and say, well, what happens, happens. That's not what this is talking about either. This is talking about being still, relaxing, sinking into the presence of God. And watch the rest of that line. Be still and know that I am God. That's why you can have peace. That's why you can have rest. That's why you can actually relax in times of trouble. To use an expression that was probably a lot more common in our day than certainly in the days of ancient Israel, you could say it this way: God's got this. And I don't say the sense that you can just give up and let God do everything and you have no responsibility. But your responsibility is not to fix the problem. Your responsibility is to draw close to the Lord, to make yourself aware through worship and prayer and the reading of the Word of the fact that God is a sovereign God. God has a plan. God has a purpose. And listen to this because it's important. God has already made provision. There's a river. God's Holy Spirit is that river. And if you'll put your faith in the Lord, if you will sink into Him, if you will relax into His presence, you will find God doing wonderful things on your behalf. And even when the nations are raging, you can have peace because of God's river.